Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us in our 1 Timothy class. We're in chapter 2, and looking at the context so far, Paul is helping and encouraging the young preacher Timothy as he is working with the congregation in Ephesus. And in chapter 1, he is encouraging Timothy to continually stand against the false teaching that is going on. And stand up against these false teachers, and he shows him why, and he shows him the danger and what the false teaching could actually lead to, and he's using that as an encouragement, and by extension to us today. We need to stand up against people who would pervert the Word of God, and as a result of perverting the Word of God, cause Christians to stray. And so that's what chapter 1 deals with. And then Paul zooms in on the subject of prayer, specifically in the public assemblies. Now, last week, and if you didn't see last week's class in regards to setting up, that chapter 2 is talking about the public worship assembly of the church. Go back and watch that. That's important for the undergirding, the foundation of what we're going to be building on today. But Paul talks about the importance of prayer in the public assembly, and the importance specifically in that first paragraph of chapter 2 of praying for all men everywhere, for all men, for all mankind. And he's constantly using that word anthropos, meaning mankind. We get our word anthropology from it, the study of man, mankind. And so he's making the distinction. These Judaizing teachers are prejudiced against the Gentiles. They're spreading this false doctrine, wanting to connect the law of Moses to the salvation of the Gentiles in order to push them away. And they have a refusal. The Jew would have a refusal to pray for the Gentiles. But Paul says here, and his point is that Jesus made it possible and gives us the standard to pray for everyone, Jew and Gentile. And so we are not to leave anyone out when we pray. And so there's a specified argument here on the purpose of prayer in the public assembly. We're to pray for everyone. We're not to leave them out because we don't like them. We're not to leave them out because of their skin color. We're not going to leave them out because of their political affiliation. That goes against what Jesus died for. That goes against what Christianity should stand for. Now, Paul, again, speaking of the public assembly, is now through verses 5 through 16, or 8 through 16, rather, is going to concentrate on gender roles within the public assembly, the worship service. This is kind of a touchy subject, and I think it always has been. We kind of like to say, well, this is something that's come up and everything, but if you look all throughout the writings of the 20th century, and into the late 18th century, I remember being in school and looking up old gospel advocates from the late 1800s. And you know what the topics were? Instrumental music and worship, the gender roles, the role of women in the church. All of none of this is new, but it periodically raises its head. And right now we are concentrated, our culture is concentrated on gender roles. And so this makes this kind of a hot topic issue. But as we see here, Paul isn't a woman hater, as he's being accused of in certain circles, even sadly in some assemblies, in some congregations of the Lord's church. They're wanting to say, well, he hated women, so we're going to have to restudy this. No, it's very, very simple, very straightforward, and we're going to see his reasoning because it goes back even before Judaism as to why this is in place. And Paul takes us back there, and we'll see that as we go through. But ironically, he's not just concentrating on what women cannot do, he's concentrating on what men and their role in the assembly is to be as well. And so if you go through this, and really you could segment this chapter into 3 parts. He's talking about what everyone is to do, anthropos, mankind. Now he's going to talk about aner, what man is to do. And then he's going to talk about what woman is to do. And so he's setting in order the public assemblies. That's all he is doing. And he's not saying one is lesser than the other, one gender is better than the other, or superior to the other. So let's go ahead and jump in. We'll read from verses 8 through the end of the chapter, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the role of men and then the role of women. and see what he has to say about these two particular groups in regard to the public assembly. So read with me 1 Timothy chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. I desire, therefore, that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and, propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission, and I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Okay. So as we see in this last paragraph, this little last half, verses 8 through 15, that Paul is dividing up the roles of women and men in the church, and he begins with a man. So there are specific guidelines that men are to comply with in regards to the public assembly. And again, I cannot stress this more. This is in regards to the public assembly. And the reason I'm stressing that will become clear as we get into some of these later verses. Okay, so first of all, in verse 8, we have, I desire therefore that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath or doubting. Now this is, the expression everywhere literally means in every place. And the context is universally applicable, meaning wherever the church meets. Again, we're talking about public assemblies. And Paul says when addressing the church that men are to be the one. And again, he switches from the word anthropos to aner. And that is very specifically the male gender. Anthropos, again, very general. That's humankind or mankind. Anthropology, study of mankind. This is aner. This is talking to the men. And he says that men everywhere the church meets, are to publicly pray. Now, he's going to address the roles of the women here in a little bit, and the participation of the women in the churches. In fact, he did this in other places as well in the book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 14:23. He really is more specific than he is here. He says, when the whole church comes together in one place, again, the public assembly, and he says, let your women keep silent in the churches, and we'll look a little bit more again as we get into the woman's role. Right now we're going to concentrate on men, but I want just to stress this is public assembly that we're talking about. And so the men are to pray when the church assembles for worship. And again, this is that word aner, andros, meaning man. And now because Paul, again, through inspiration, is very explicit here, that brings up this principle of the authority of silence in the scriptures. When God, through inspiration, specifies one thing, that excludes everything else. And so when he explicitly says that the men are to pray, that excludes everyone else. So that would exclude the women leading a prayer in the public assemblies. Well, why is that? He's going to explain in just a minute. This is an extremely clear passage, and it's hard for us not to want to muddy the waters with, well, what about this and what about this? And we bring in a lot of these modern cultural arguments into this, really muddies the water. This is very, very clear, and he actually does go into the reasoning in this as he sums this section up. And so the men are to pray in the public assemblies everywhere. Now he says the lifting up of hands. That's the way the Jews would pray in the synagogues. Now all throughout this, he's been talking about the Judaizing false teachers, And then he's talking about how they would want to exclude people from their prayers, but he says, no, you pray for everyone because Jesus died for everyone. And so when you go into the public assemblies, you have the men stand up and lift up their holy hands as they're praying for everyone. And the whole point of this is that we're to be praying for everyone, lifting up holy hands. Well, that doesn't mean we sit there in the middle of worship and do this number and sway like we see sometimes in modern churches. Not that there would be anything sinful or wrong with that. This isn't a command for that. This is bringing our minds back that this is truly the public assembly, because when the Jewish teachers or the Jewish men would get together to pray publicly, they would lift their hands to God, palms upward to God. This was their posture for prayer. And so Paul is using that to help the Christians of the first century see that we're to be praying together in the assembly and the men are to be leading the prayer. And he says you pray without wrath and doubting. You pray in faith. James talks about that. Prayer needs to be made in faith without doubting. You pray without wrath. You don't pray vindictively. Lord, strike these men down right now because they're doing this. You know, you don't pray like that. Yeah, but I think the word wrath here really means the wrath that's internal in your heart, that would cause you to leave someone out of your prayers. Well, I don't like them. They're ugly to me, or maybe I don't like where they come from or their political views, so I'm not going to pray for them. That kind of wrath, especially considering what he has just talked about in the last paragraph there. Now we get into the women's role in the public assembly, women's role in the church. So there's specific guidelines, and this takes up the majority of this paragraph, quite frankly. But it does so because he talks about the reasoning behind everything. So he says that women are to have a specific role in the public assemblies. They're to be a part of the public assemblies. They're not to be excluded. Some groups in centuries past would have the assembly split, and the men would sit on one side, the women on the other. Part of that was cultural. And again, nothing necessarily sinful of that. It went with their culture. But I wonder how much that culture was led by misinterpreting these verses. I know in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century, culture was led by misinterpretation of these verses. And we'll make some mention of that as we go through them. But again, nothing sinful necessarily in splitting up the auditorium. Is kind of strange. I'd like to sit with my family when I'm not leading in worship. But anyway, so specific guidelines for the women there. And again, these are through inspiration. But let's look at it a little bit at a time here. Verse 9, it says, in like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel. Also. Okay, so in like manner, here's how the men are to act in worship. Now here's how the women are to act in worship. And that's fair, is it not? Here's guidelines for men, guidelines for everybody. Now guidelines for men. Now here's the guidelines for the women. Here's how the women are to, in like manner, are to act in worship. Well, first of all, let's talk about the look. They're to adorn themselves in modest apparel. The word adorn themselves. Adorn is the word cosmetic. Oh, we get our word cosmetics from this. Now, this has nothing to do with makeup, okay? Even though we do get our word cosmetics from this, but it means to arrange or to put in order. Cosmetics refers to using makeup to put your face in order. Sometimes you'll hear older women say, well, I haven't put my face on yet. Well, that's where that comes from. This idea of cosmetics, putting in order or to arranging. Now, the women are to adorn themselves. They're to put on something specifically. And there's kind of a laundry list here. And he says modest apparel. We'll look at that in a second. I don't want to quite go there yet. But he also says with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Okay. So, evidently, again, Paul is addressing an issue here, a possible issue, that some who were very well off were really daunting themselves up, and as a result, causing a ruckus in the assembly, taking the attention off of Jesus and putting it onto them by the way they looked. Now, that could be done in many different ways, couldn't it? It can be done with skimpy dress, and when we hear that word modest, boom, that's what we go right into, and we make up these rules that are very arbitrary. It can't be more than an inch over the knee, or some places say 2 inches, and I don't know if the 1 inchers or the 2 inchers are in conflict with one another. I don't think so. I'm being facetious here, but we make up all these rules. No spaghetti straps, no this. Well, we want to be dressed modestly. That is, and we use the word modest as in to clothe our nakedness, and that's true. We definitely want to do that, and there's several reasons why we do that. We do that for respect for our brethren in Christ who might struggle with the idea of lust. So you respect your brethren, and you do that not to cause a stumbling block. Again, it's not about me; it's about others. That's the life of a Christian. We're to continually think about others. There's some things I would prefer to do, but sometimes I don't, or I restrain from that, simply because it may be a stumbling block for someone I'm going to be around in that moment. And so when we're in a public assembly or in a mixed group, you don't want to come in dressed skimpily. That's not proper for worship. It takes the attention off of Jesus. But at the same time, and what Paul is dealing with here is actually just the opposite. It's this idea of being orderly and decent. That's what the word modest is here. And it refers specifically to the idea of the decorations that they're using. Evidently, these women were coming in dressed to the nines, all kinds of probably makeup, all kinds of jewelry to show, and they're trying to dress themselves up to show how beautiful they can be. And we like to see attractive women. We do. Men do. Women like to feel attractive and look attractive, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when it takes away from the purpose of the worship assemblies, then it's a problem. And so Paul says, dress in moderation. Dress in moderation. Don't be modest in your dress. Don't bring undue attention to yourself. And that can be true for men as well, by the way. You walk in a three-piece suit into a congregation that's made up of mainly farmers who are in their jeans and overalls, you're going to stand out and bring attention to yourself. That's not modest apparel. If I walk in extremely short shorts and a tank top, and, I'm going to bring undue attention to myself, that's not modest apparel. And it's the same with the women. And so Paul specifically here is talking about overdressing. But underdressing would be a problem as well. Even though we put our emphasis, our exclamation mark on the underdressing, Paul's really talking about overdressing here if we were going to be very, very specific. But he says that the women should adorn themselves. Here's what you are to put on. Not all of the stuff that brings undue attention to yourself, but you dress with propriety. And the word there is shamefacedness. And now Paul's talking about internal attributes as well as external. Propriety means this idea of prudence and dignity. It's the idea is what would stop one from behaving in a shameful way. You come into the assembly with a modicum of humility. And when you come into worship, moderation, the King James says sobriety. The second we hear the word sober, we go right into the drinking mode. Sobriety comes from a word that really means moderation. It means the idea of sound judgment or self-control. It's right thinking. You come in with shamefacedness and right thinking. And that's what he says here. You think right about the way. Use some common sense in how you're going to dress. Use some common sense in how you're going to act. And that really is again, so general and universal through all of mankind, but here specifically with the women in the public worship. Now, some will want to take this, and some religions will want to take this, and even today in the denominational world, I think certain segments of Pentecostalism, certain segments that believe that you cannot dress certain ways universally 24/7, and so no makeup at all. You never cut or style your hair. You never do this, never do that. Sometimes we'll pick them out with the long skirts going down to the ankles and all this other kind of stuff. This is a requirement in the worship assemblies. This isn't universal for all, and Paul doesn't even prohibit makeup and jewelry and that kind of thing here. He's just saying use it in moderation. Use it with right thinking. Don't overdress to bring undue attention to yourself. And then he says good works. And here's his whole point. Don't worry about the outside. Your beauty comes from the inside. And this is true with everyone, but specifically, he's talking about women in the assembly. And I'm going to continue to stress that so we don't get the wrong idea or take this out of context. He says, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Here's where your beauty comes. Your beauty comes from the heart. It comes internally. When you are a godly individual, full to the point of running over with good works. It's not about your external display. It's about what's on the inside. We hear that growing up, don't we? It's not about what you look like. It's about who you are on the inside. Inner beauty outshines the outward beauty. And I think if you live long enough, you learn that lesson very, very well. And so, now, why is all this? Why is all this? Because now he's going to tell the women in verses 11 and 12, okay, here's your attitude and your look when you come in. Make sure it's the inner beauty that you're focusing on, not the outward beauty. Don't bring undue attention to yourself and overdressing and looking all bawdy and stuff. And so here's the next thing he addresses to women, and this is where it really gets sticky. Oh, this is where we like to get our ire up. He says in verses 11 and 12 that the women are to learn in silence with all submission. Woo! Oh, that's politically incorrect right there, isn't it? Well, what does he mean? Again, we're talking the worship assembly. Talking in the worship assembly. Women are to learn in silence. Now, in the public assemblies, this word silence is translated from a word meaning not to cause a disturbance. Okay? This word silence does not mean shut up. This word silence does not mean keep your trap shut. This word silence means don't cause a disturbance in the assembly. And don't cause a disturbance to another in the assembly. Now, because of the English language, we have in the past concentrated on this silence as the prohibition of speech. But this is the prohibition of causing a disturbance. And it really goes right in line with what Paul would tell the Corinthians. Evidently, as they were going through their service, one would stand up, and if it was one's husband, the woman would interrupt him and say, well, wait a minute, you forgot this, or wait a minute this, or what about this? Start asking questions, everything. Paul says, you keep that at home. You be in silence. You don't cause a disturbance. Now, the prohibition isn't, again, absolute silence. It's not meaning shut your trap and don't make a sound. That's something you might have heard 50, 60 years ago. That's not what this means. This means not to cause a disturbance. If it meant not to make a sound, then the women would be prohibited to sing. And that's something that's commanded of all Christians. But rather, this kind of keeping silence, this is specifically in regards to the areas of teaching, praying, in the public leadership of the worship service. Now, you may say, well, wait a minute. Women are just as capable of making a speech. Women are just as capable of speaking in public as a man is. And that's true. In fact, you can go into board meetings and you see women talk. You go into different meetings where women are leading, and sometimes they're very, very good at it. So why the prohibition? If one is better than another who is a male, let the woman speak. And that's kind of how we think today because of how culture is. But again, this isn't about ability. This is about order. Paul is ordering the worship assembly. And he says the males are to take the lead in the public assembly. The males are to pray. The males are to lead in the learning of the church. The women are not to cause a disturbance during this by speaking out or trying to overtalk the man or usurp the man in this. And they do this with submission. Now, we don't like the word submission. We don't like to submit. No one likes to submit. I see that speed limit that says 55, but 65 feels so right. It's that kind of thing. But I have to submit. I have to pull my foot up and make sure I'm going the speed limit. That's submission. Submission is something, it's not a dirty word. It shouldn't be a dirty word. It's a voluntary choice. And it means to place one under the authority of another. And so when the preacher stands up to give a sermon, the women place themselves under his authority as he gives that sermon. When the man stands up to lead a prayer, the women of the congregation place themselves in submission under his authority as he leads that prayer, and they don't cause a disturbance by over speaking or by taking that public spot. This is something that has to be controlled internally. This isn't controlled by another. Sometimes we think of submission as slavery. No, 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 no. This doesn't have to do with value or worth. This has to do with the gender roles and the orderliness of the worship assembly. So in public worship, in regards to teaching, God forbids the women to overtake that responsibility and places that responsibility with the man. And he gives a reason. And to do that, he goes all the way back to the beginning of time. This is where it gets very, very interesting. This doesn't have to do with the gender roles of the first century. This doesn't have to do with the gender roles found under the Mosaic age, under the law of Moses. This goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and that's where he takes us. In verse 13, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. So we go back to Genesis chapter 2, and we start looking at the priority that God gave the creation. So on that sixth day, he makes man. He creates man, Adam. And he gives Adam dominion over the entirety of the earth and over all living things. That means Adam is to rule the earth. We don't like the word rule. We give it a different meaning today. But it's the idea of having authority over all living things. Now, God saw, and we know the record, that it was not good for man to be alone. It's the first negative thing God mentions in Scripture. It's not good that man should be alone. And so he creates from the rib of man, Eve, a woman whom Adam would then name Eve, meaning mother of all living. And she was created to be his helpmeet. Now, we use that and we see the word helper and we go, well, the word help and helpmeet, well, she's his helper. And that's true. They are to work together. Husband, wife works together and accomplishing goals. But the word helpmeet is so much more. It literally is the mirror opposite. Woman is to be the mirror opposite of man. And in other words, she makes up the attributes that man doesn't necessarily have. And so they work in tandem. They become a complete pair, walking side by side, hand in hand, together. Help meet. Now, the priority is that the husband is the head of the wife because of the creation order. But priority does not mean superiority. And quite frankly, I wonder if we would have such a radical women's movement today if we as men in decades past wouldn't have made priority equate with superiority. I think we as men have gone to an extreme in culture, putting women down, causing women to finally get fed up and push back. This isn't talking about superiority. It's simply talking about priority. God didn't create woman to be your slave. God created woman to complete you. Remember the famous line in Jerry Maguire, "You complete me." That is exactly what God intended. God intended woman to complete man. In fact, Peter in 1 Peter 3 and verse 7 says that she is to be a fellow heir of the grace of life. This is a team effort. And so man has priority in creation, and Paul reminds us of that. Secondly, he reminds us of the role that woman played in the fall of mankind. So again, we're back in Genesis 3. That's where he's taking our minds. And he says, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. And so here is this idea of Eve getting what's the word I'm looking for? She gets into conversation with Satan, that serpent in Genesis 3. He deceives her into eating that fruit from the forbidden tree of knowledge of good and evil. She gives it to Adam. She played a role there, a primary role. And so when you go back and you look at the curses that God gives, God talks to the serpent first, then to the woman, then to Adam. And so God places certain things over Eve. In Genesis 3 and verse 16, the New King James says, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And the Hebrew there, and I think modern translations really kind of fix this, says that your desire should be contrary to your husband. And in other words, you're going to have the desire to rule over him, but he is to rule over you. And so this order in the church of the first century is an order of priority, not superiority, but it also fulfills or part of the curse that women find themselves because of the actions of one, Eve, back in Genesis chapter 3. Paul reiterates that here. The men are to take the lead, and the woman is to submit. And again, this is under the guise of worship assembly specifically. Now, he goes on to say, just because Eve is guilty of this, and just because you, this role that you have in the worship assembly is a result of her guilt from Genesis 3, don't think that salvation cannot be yours. And so he continues on, and he says, nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing. Now, I think we've made a big error in translating this verse here. I disagree with a lot of the commentaries that are out there, especially those that came from the mid to early 20th century. When we talk about she shall be saved in childbearing, many times commentators, again, I think picking up the cultural norms of the centuries past, will pick this up and say, well, women are saved when they have children. And so that's their role. They're to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. They're to keep their mouth shut at all times. That's not what Paul's saying here at all. I don't believe that. The context doesn't show that, as we'll see in just a minute. First of all, this is the worship assembly. She is to be in silence and submission during the worship assembly, specifically, according to Paul, right here. That's the context. And so we're not going to drift off away from the worship assembly in this study. Now, he says, nevertheless, she. Well, that's singular. That's singular. So who has he been talking about? Where has Paul been taking us? Back to the garden. Back to the garden. And I believe that this is a reference to Eve. Eve will be saved in childbearing. Well, how? Well, if you remember in verse 15, as God is still speaking to the serpent, he makes the first prediction, the first prophecy in regarding the Christ who will come out of the seed of a woman, he says. Eve is going to be saved in childbearing. How are people saved today? It's through the cross, is it not? How are people saved today? It's by the blood of Jesus, who is the offspring, comes from the seed of woman. Man didn't have anything to do with bringing Jesus into the world. He's a son of God, not the son of Joseph. He's the adopted son of Joseph. But he is the biological son of Eve. She shall be saved in childbearing. Why? Because it's through the seed of woman that the Christ would come into the world. I think that's key here. And I think that follows correctly the context that we find ourselves. You may disagree with that, that's fine. But I think that's what the text is clearly saying. Now, he switches. If they, now who's the they? Well, we're talking about women. If she, Eve, if they, well, what do women have to do in order to find salvation? Continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Now, here's my question to you. You take that faith, love, holiness, self-control. Does that exclude men in that? He's talking about women. The subject is women in the worship assembly. And now he's talking about the salvation of women. Just because the man is to take public leadership in the worship assembly, that doesn't mean women can't be saved. Just because of what Eve did doesn't mean women can't be saved. But if women want to be saved, they need to show faith, love, holiness with self-control. How are men saved? By living a life of faith, love, holiness, self-control. But here specifically, he's talking to women. And so the women's requirements for salvation isn't different from the man's requirement for salvation, is it? It deals with faith, living by faith, obeying the faith, the New Testament standard. that we have. Loving God, loving one another, and living a life of holiness, living a life trying to be what God is. Holy, be ye holy that I am holy, separate and apart from the world. And you do that how? By having self-control in your life, by saying no to self. If women do that, you're going to find salvation. If men do that, you're going to find salvation. But here specifically, he's talking to women in general. And how is that made possible? By the cross, by Jesus, by what he did. And he came through the seed of a woman. So, there you have it, the gender roles for the public assembly. We shouldn't find this offensive. We shouldn't find this insulting. Sometimes we think of the idea of, well, why can't a woman stand up and speak and lead a prayer? And then, well, this is why. And Paul takes us back all the way to the beginning. It's not about ability. It's not about superiority of the man. Nothing like that. This is about simply the gender roles that God set forth. And he gives very clearly the reason why by taking us back to the beginning of time, back to the beginning of the Bible in Genesis 2 and chapter 3. And so it's fairly clear. And yet sometimes we like to just concentrate in on the small particulars of this. Sometimes we have erred in the past where we want to take this out of the regular worship service and apply it to everyone everywhere. And, I know of a situation where there was a man in a particular congregation who thought every woman was under his control. Well, no, it's not. If we look at other scriptures, Ephesians 5, you look at Peter in his writings, the women are to obey their own husband is what the original sound. And so he's like, well, I'm a man. I can tell you what to do and I can tell you what to... No, you can't. Your authority is over your wife. That's how God has set forth in the beginning of time. And we can go back to Genesis 3 like we did earlier and look at that. But because of attitudes like that, I think that has caused the opposite extreme to become popular. And so you have that pendulum of extremes that are happening in regard to gender roles, and it just really shouldn't be. It's very simple. I know of individuals who say that this silence, women are to learn in silence. People say, well, they can't teach men. They're only authorized to teach women and children. They can't teach men. Well, there's a ton of problems when you come into that. Is there anybody on this earth that is exempt from Matthew 28? The Great Commission, go into all the world and teach the gospel to every creature. That's for all mankind. All Christians are to do that. You have the example of Aquila and Priscilla in Acts 18 and 19 as they take Apollos over to the side. And the fact that Priscilla is named first there gives us the idea that she was the one that was taking the lead there. I know of individuals in the church who wrongly say that a wife cannot teach her own husband if her husband is not a member of the church. And so I guess she's just to sit back, and here's a man that she loves with all of her heart, and she's going to watch him and let him go to hell because she can't teach him the gospel. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. This has led to all sorts of just erroneous thinking. But when you break down the wording, it becomes fairly clear, I think. And I hope this clears up some of the things. You may not agree with me on every aspect of that. I would suggest, if that's the case, look at the text. Go by the text and make sure everybody, we all, including me, need to make sure that we're not letting social cues or cultural morality influence what the text says and read that into the text. But instead, just look at the text and see what the text says. And I think it's very, very clear that when we deal straight with the text, what Paul is intending for our public worship assemblies, it shouldn't be offensive. It shouldn't be anything that should turn people away. If you're right thinking, if you're sober thinking, as Paul likes to say, I think it's, again, just very, very clear. I hope you've enjoyed this study. I hope maybe it's answered some questions for you. Maybe it's created some more questions. Feel free to message us and we can deal with that later. I hope you'll make your plans to come be with us Wednesday night. Wednesday nights, we're doing a study on Daniel, and we're online, but also we are live in the building on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock right here at the Pottsville Church of Christ. Hope you make your plans to be with us. Also, don't forget, next Sunday morning at 10 a.m., we'll be worshiping together. But again, if you're feeling sick, and I know we have some who are sick right now who are hopefully watching at home, I'm sure they are, and can't be with us live, that's understandable. We want you to stay safe. If you have conditions that, because of the pandemic, You can't get out. We want you to stay safe, stay at home, watch us at home, worship with us at home, and make plans to either be here live at 10 a.m. or be online with us at 10 a.m. as we worship together. And then on Sunday nights, right now, we're going through 1st and 2nd Timothy. We're in 1 Timothy 2. Next week, we'll be in 1 Timothy 3. And so we're going to start discussion on the qualifications of elders, which, again, there's a few in here that can really be taken out of context, and we tend to twist into something that doesn't mean. But we'll look at that, Lord willing, next week, 5 o'clock, online only. We're not in the church building on Sunday nights as of right now. So hope everyone has a wonderful week. Hope everyone is staying safe, and hope to see you Wednesday night at 7.